I have recently started teaching myself how to use breadboards, and some projects that I did in Lua a very long time ago I'm now revisiting in breadboards just to get the basics down. And one of the things that I was re-implementing was a concept for an adventurecraft hovercraft control system, which is extremely useful because it is able to keep heading and altitude. So if I use the custom control keys, I can go up and then it will stabilize at the new altitude. I can tell it to go down and it will stabilize at that altitude, and same with yaw. So I can turn it to face a certain heading and then it will auto stabilize. And if I give it control inputs that disturb it, it'll self-correct. So while tackling this problem in breadboards, I came across two kind of novel problems which I think are interesting enough to make a video out of and go over separately. So the control system isn't actually that complicated. The first interesting problem that I came across was that you can't have a loop inside a breadboard, so you can't have a block that feeds input back into itself, no matter how far apart those actions are separated. Like you could have 3 blocks in a row, but if any input goes back, it will just completely shut down and not work. But a fairly easy way around this is to use the custom propulsion settings. So what I have here is, this is the machine that controls the altitude setting. So I have minimum and maximum altitude. They go into this evaluator. I'm reading the custom drives, so A and B, which are just 5 and 6 by default, turning that into a +1 or -1. And then here I'm just saying if the current point is greater than or equal to the max value, and we're trying to increase it, then don't. It basically just blocks it if we reach these minimum and maximum values. So if I now tell it to descend, it will get down to 10 and then just stop because it's hit the minimum altitude. And if I tell it to ascend, it'll get to 200, the maximum altitude, and then stop feeding the input. So then what happens is, this is now our set altitude. This is what we want to go to. And then I output this into the custom output. Then I can read the custom output and feed it back in, and that's how you can get a proper feedback loop. The problem is that these drives are limited between 0 and 1, so you can basically just scale them down to whatever you need. So in my case, I just divided it by 1,000 and then multiplied it by 1,000 when I read it back out. And so now you can see that I am outputting 200 and I'm getting 200 back. But if I were to try and, let's say, take this output, which is my final output, and put it here, everything would break because it doesn't like it when you have a loop. So instead we can just do that and everything's fine. And then the desired output just goes to a PID and then the up propulsion editor. So that part's fairly trivial, but that's just a novel way of getting around that particular breadboard limitation. So the second novel problem, which is actually slightly more interesting, is that of yaw control. So I've seen it crop up a couple times in sort of Reddit posts and forums and stuff, people asking how they can use a PID for yaw, and basically the answer is you can't. But I'm here to tell you that that is not true. You absolutely can. You just need to kind of hack your way around the way the PID works. So again, we have our custom inputs. We turn that into a 0 or 1. So if I hit my controls, it goes -1 and +1. Then we use the accumulator to basically store that value over time and let it increment and decrement. Here it's set to greater than 360. So if we get to 360, it's just going to reset back to 360, which takes a while because turning around is hard. And then there's an independent system. So that's if it goes positive, but if it goes negative, I have this math evaluator here, which basically just lets it go negative to infinity. It doesn't matter, it'll just keep wrapping around. But there's a modulo here that keeps the value between 0 and 360. So once we have our our desired yaw value here between 0 and 360, we take our current yaw and also bring it between 0 and 160, 0 and 360, sorry. So now what we do, the problem with a PID, if you use it in this way, if you were just to feed these inputs into it, is that if you cross over the boundary behind you from, say, negative 179 to positive 180, the way a PID works internally is it takes the two inputs and finds the difference between them. So your current value and then your set point, finds the error in there and then does the control loop from that error. So the problem is that when you go from this extreme transition, suddenly the PID thinks, oh God, there's so much error, and then we'll try and do a full loop around just to get like 1 degree to the other side. It will do the 359 degrees. It doesn't always happen, but it will happen if you very slowly approach that transition point, so then you don't overshoot it. Because if you overshoot it, then you're suddenly back in a regime of like minus 170 to minus 175, for example, and just the inertia of your craft will fix that. But in this case, if you approach it very slowly, suddenly it'll do a full spin around. So what we have to do is we have to take that error calculation and pull it outside of the PID. So what we do is we say the set point is always 0 and then feed in our own custom error value. And by feeding this manual error value into the PID, we can ensure that it never has this sharp transition. So now the error stays between negative 180 and 180, but it's actually only the error. So it should stay relatively small, assuming the PID is doing its job. So even if we thrash this, so we go back and forth, we can see it's only getting up to about 10-ish at the very extreme, and that's the most extreme. You would see this if the PID wasn't doing its jobs or the vehicle was losing control. So for example, if we turn off its ability to actually control the vehicle and now start giving it turn commands, you can see the error is building up just because the PID isn't actually controlling the craft anymore, so our yaw isn't actually changing. So the error is getting quite extreme, but again, that would only happen if your PID wasn't doing its job. While it's doing its job, it keeps the error very minimal, and we never have a sharp transition despite our angle having this massive change. So even if we slowly approach this value, you see the error value actually only goes sort of in the 1s and 2s, even as we make this big jump in the yaw read. And that's how you can use a PID to control your yaw. So the end result of all of this work is that our craft will always maintain the heading that it's set, and will always correct if it gets disturbed. And the altitude control, well, it works like altitude control, and we have all the benefits of using a PID that we usually would. So I hope you learned something, or hope that was useful for building your own craft or doing whatever it is you do in adventure mode. And yeah, thanks for your time.